Hi everyone, I'm Jacob Lind and I'm from Malmö University, a researcher, currently doing a postdoc in Copenhagen at EuMIGS Center there, Research Center on Migration. I'm wrapping up a project on called MIMI, which is about young people and their in vulnerable conditions, mostly refugees and other young migrants who've come to Sweden and other countries across Europe, and where we are looking at how they're build a new life in their new host countries. So somewhat overlapping with Karin has been doing, writing some stuff right now, also thinking about these things of conviviality or meaning of friendship and so forth. But what I'm going to be presenting today is something I've been doing a little bit on the side in relation to this, because one of the groups that we interviewed in MIMI was unaccompanied minor, youth, this category. So I felt like I wanted to get a better overview of what's been done in Sweden in the last few decades, because it's been I mean, I've noticed I know most of the people that do this kind of research, and I noticed that there's been quite a large increase of research, and I've felt like maybe someone needs to get an overview of this. So I've tried to write a review article about unaccompanied migrant minors and youth in Sweden in the last 2 decades. So basically what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present how the method of this. So I thought this is also a little bit of a, just a way to inspire you when you do literature reviews or etc. for your thesis or whatever. Papers you're going to be writing, so like an overall inspiration for that, how one can work with that, but then also, within the topic of unaccompanied migrants, youth in Sweden. So, so the aim of this paper that I'm writing, which is not done, I'll show how far I've come. But the aim is to conduct an integrative literature review, and this is a kind of specific form of literature review. I'm not going to go that deep into that method, but that's the kind of overall take, where I want to review research conducted in Sweden in relation to unaccompanied migrants in the 21st century. And my kind of question I'm asking is, what new knowledge can we produce through synthesizing all the research conducted so far? So many of the studies that I'm finding are very careful of making strong arguments based on small-scale qualitative data. So can a review then maybe give these arguments a bit of a stronger basis, or is there something more we can say by looking at all this research at the same time? And also I want to, consider, do we need more research, or is the field a little bit saturated, or what kind of research could potentially be useful in the future in this field? So here you have a graph where you have the dotted line is the number of unaccompanied youth and minors arriving in Sweden to apply for asylum since the 2000s. And you all recognize this spike in 2015, where Sweden received the most applications for asylum from unaccompanied minors per capita of all countries in Europe by far. So Sweden stands out in that. If you look at per capita, in Germany they had more actual people applying, but in Sweden per capita we had the most in Europe at the time. So, and there's, as you can see as well, some kind of overlap between the number of publications, the interest in the topic, and the number of people actually coming. So, and this is a lot of the research that I've reviewed, a lot of the articles I found, they start with this notion of, oh, in 2015 there were so many people coming, so that's why we do this. So that's the rationality for much of the research, especially in the recent years. Although it started earlier, and the phenomena has been growing and gaining growing interest, both from research and politics, since around 2005, 2007, when this concept of unaccompanied minors became more of a common concept in policy, etc. So the focus of the study is research that in some way relate to unaccompanied migrants, including comparative research, comparing Sweden with other countries, but it has to have a focus on Sweden as well. And the political and discursive category of unaccompanied, in Sweden is called ensamkommande, so it's a very specific term that doesn't mean anything else. that's the focus, and I'm focusing on it, and a lot of the research actually focus on this political and discursive category of unaccompanied in itself. So it's not, some research take it more as it is, as a category that's being used, but a lot of the research also problematizes this category. But I still, it's still very useful for narrowing down a project like this. So, and I include both minors and youth, because even as long as you arrive as a minor, a lot of people then stay for a longer time and turn 18, and as well, this age assessment is also a huge issue of like how old are actually people, depending on how old they claim to be, and then what the authorities say that they are when they do age assessment. So minors and youth is included, but the category is still unaccompanied. And it's a very actually practical search term when it comes to doing a review. When you do researches in databases, like if you have a more general theme, it can be quite difficult to narrow down your search. So even though I spent like a good 2-3 weeks of searching and finding all my publications, I think a lot of people spend a lot more time than that, because when they don't have as a clear-cut kind of category to use, because even those publications who don't want to reproduce this notion of unaccompanied, because it can be seen as problematic, they still refer to other publications in their bibliographies that use unaccompanied in the title. So in that sense, I through this search, I've managed to find more or less everything that's been produced about the issue of young migrants coming to Sweden, claiming asylum on their own. So the first academic publication I found is from 2000, but there's been some reports, gray literature from civil society organizations. Save the Children primarily started already in the 80s, but it really starts, as you saw in this graph, it really starts around 2000, that this concept is being discussed more in academia. And what I did, I entered these different, you see at the top, the keywords in a few different academic databases. So we have this, the top one there is the Swedish National Library database, where I found quite a few of most of the Swedish-speaking publications that weren't found anywhere else. But then, apart from that, Scopus gave me the most hits, so to say. But there's a lot of similarities in the publications that are published in those databases. I would say that perhaps Web of Science, Scopus, and Sociological Abstracts, for example, and the last one there, ASSIAI, they have quite a lot of similar results, whereas the PubMed one, I found a few more kind of medically focusing articles that I didn't find through the others. So there is it's important when you do this if you want to do like a complete have a complete overview, you really need to make sure you look into different kind of databases where you could potentially find publications that wouldn't be found anywhere else. So as you can see, I got more than 1,000 hits. I had to manually read through all these pages of search results towards all the way to the end. So I did that for all these searches, looking through abstracts and trying to see and find anything that's relevant and fits my criteria. And after I'd done that and only included peer-reviewed research, no reports and so forth, and also I read through the bibliographies of some of the earlier literature and all the reviews I could find that in themselves reviewed part of this research. So it was also kind of a manual work of then going through the publications themselves, not all of them, but the key ones, to see if I can find any other publications that weren't covered in the searches. And I ended up with 228 publications, of which 164 are journals, and the rest are theses and books chapters. And then what I did, I imported all these into Zotero to start with. I don't know how familiar you are with this. It's similar to Mendeley. Maybe you use that, but it's a very convenient program for keeping track of your PDFs basically. And you can then it's very easy to get an overview. You can do searches in that search field for full text searches, so you can find anything that's in your library. You can find whatever publication includes any kind of word through that's just such a search. And then so it's a very convenient way of like starting off and organizing your data. But what I did in the next step is then also to put everything in an Excel sheet. This is just a few of them, and And one of the reasons why I wanted to have done this as well is because I also want to count actually the number of participants. So I used to see I can include these numbers in these columns and get an overview of participations. And so just to show, I have only so far done a third of the items counting, and so far it's 200 individual unaccompanied migrants who've been interviewed individually. Or including focus groups estimations. But yeah, so I don't know if this means that the total is 600. It's also impossible to tell how, if any of these have been included in more than one study. There might be a few participants, but I don't think it's like a huge part of them, because a lot of the studies are conducted in different places, different cities around Sweden. So it's probably it's quite a lot of people out of these 30 to 60,000 total, or maybe more. I should know that number, but that have arrived in the last 20 years that have been included in qualitative research with individual interviews. And then a lot of the work also focus on the support workers, people working at homes, assistant care homes, support families, nurses, and so forth. And then there's also a few, quite a few that focus on the statistical data. And in Sweden, we have quite high quality statistical data through our Statistics Sweden authority. So it's quite convenient to do searches where you can include this, the unaccompanied asylum seeking minors in your data sets and differentiate them from the rest of the population. And then there was also a few surveys and health screenings, also with support personnel. And then there was a few additional kind of publications that didn't fit in any of these other categories. So then I included, I imported all these 218 or 28, I can't remember, publications into NVivo. I don't know how familiar you are with NVivo, but it's a program where you can. So when I imported the full documents, the full PDF, I can then again do full text searches in this whole body of literature. And then what you do is you open it. You can just open the PDF inside NVivo and you highlight things, and then you drag these highlights to different codes, and that way you can code the different all the different items you have in your collection. But you can also do like a search, like I did here. You see I search for gender in this unsaved query, and then you get all the publications that I used where the word gender is included, and you can see how often they've been included, and you can go through those separately. And so it's also a more kind of advanced way of getting an overview and analyzing and coding the data. So that's where I am right now. I'm in the middle of this work in NVivo. And through NVivo, I just, you can, for example, you can create a word cloud like I did here of all the publications. So you see that the focus, these are the 30 most used words, and excluding small words like and, or, I, you, so forth. So all the kind of key concepts, and you see that a lot of the focus is on asylum and refugee work, and also social work, and also partly there's the key migration agency there. You see it's mentioned a lot, and yeah, policy is also of course something, and rights is so these kind of expected, I would say, probably keywords that are most common across these publications. And so far I would have wanted to have come further before today, but what I've done so far is I've identified some different research fields where I've kind of grouped so far quite roughly all the publications into. And this includes, so I know the topic of this lecture series is also partly reception of asylum seekers, and you have quite a lot of work that is, so the first bullet point there you have care work, social work, reception work, and studies of how these young people are being received. But then you also have a lot of focus on education and overall everyday life agency and rights of young migrants and so forth, and the issue of integration as a kind of very strong policy concept in Sweden, where some research wants to be very relevant to that. And you have mental health and overall health, and then also more focus on the policing part and the deportation work and how that works, and from different angles, more critical and also more kind of just looking from the inside on the police department's work. You do have some of the early work was really important, focus on discourse, this discourse of unaccompanied minors, which has become really like, has grown into its life of its own, you can say. And it's to understand the topic of unaccompanied minors, minor refugees or asylum seekers in Sweden, you really also need to understand the way this concept has what kind of got in its life on its own. And so that there's quite a few studies looking into that. And then and recently also it's been, there's been a lot of critique in the way that Sweden have been treating this group that came. So some of them got asylum pretty quickly, and that was great for them, but a lot of young people have also been refused asylum, even though they come from Afghanistan or any other war-torn country. So not all of these minors have been getting asylum in Sweden. So and there's been a lot of critique about how these different groups have been treated, and there's been many different kinds of legislations, new legislations, and then extensions to that and changes to that, and across the last 5 to 10 years. So, and this has been really, so this group has kind of become a little bit of a token for the whole way, the debate after 2015 and the way Sweden changed from a kind of open, generous asylum policy towards now it's kind of turning into the most restrictive country in Europe, and the story about unaccompanied minors and youth are very much a part of this the kind of narratives that have made possible this drastic change. But it's also kind of it's also a lot of people have been involved, a lot of civil society people that have engaged themselves in this group have also experienced a lot of their view on how the Swedish state, the Swedish welfare state works and are supposed to protect vulnerable groups has also changed when they've seen how the state has been so repressive towards this group. So I will show you actually what I thought, just to give you in the context of this seminar series, I thought it would be interesting to give you like an example, a snapshot from some of these categories, that just to show you a bit of the breadth and width of publications that has come out from Sweden in the last 20 years in relation to unaccompanied minors. And from what I've seen also, again, in relation to per capita, I'm pretty sure that Sweden has the most publications per capita also on unaccompanied minors. I can't remember how closely I did that check, but I'm pretty sure that we also have the most publications per capita or per researchers in Sweden. So one example, for example, from my university is the recent dissertation about Afghan youth and their relationship to sports in their everyday life. So, for example, this work by Sepandarma Mashregi is about it has a decolonial framework to demonstrate how migrant youth in Sweden navigate, experience, challenge, and generate knowledge in relation to physical activity and sport. So, for the Afghan youth in this study, sport and physical activity was not just a distinct entity, but rather it was intertwined with various aspects of their lives, such as their experiences of child labor, pleasures, hope for the future, leisure, social and mental aspects, and migration experiences. So that's kind of neat entrance point for this. I mean, a lot of young people have spent a lot of their time doing sports. It's to kind of cope with the harsh situation they're meeting here in Sweden, as well as with the trauma that they might have brought with them from their country of origin. And then you have within social work, this is actually an article from a special issue that I was editing together with some colleagues. So it's a little bit of a shameless plug here for that special issue, but our colleague Marlene Holmlund did a really interesting article there where she studied how social work gets kind of entangled into policing and expulsion. And so the article aims to show an example of how municipal policy promotes the social work of policing and expulsion, but it's represented as child welfare. So then she kind of criticizes the role of social work to do the work of the border police. And it deconstructs how productive and repressive elements of care and control are intertwined into a rationality of police empowerment and a technology of activation into expulsion. So this rationality then encourages a reorienting motivations of young people for them to reorient their motivation to stay in Sweden into willing self-exclusion after they received a negative asylum decision. And this is, the practice is to do this through collaborative reflection and normalization of expulsion as a kind of crisis management and as being part of actually child welfare in itself. So that, I thought that was a really interesting article. But then you have from the kind of opposite perspective, work by people in Umeå University at the police research department, where Sundqvist studied the processes of forced repatriation of unaccompanied refugee children, but focusing on the role of social workers and police officers and how they created the most dignified forced repatriation based on human dignity, focusing then more on the well-being of the officers who partake in these deportations rather than primarily the young people themselves. So that's a kind of another completely opposite kind of starting point for looking at what policing is and in this context and how it can be understood. In relation to education, my supervisors, Anna Lundberg and Michael Strange, they were my supervisors as PhDs, but they wrote a really interesting text on how rights are negotiated in relation to unaccompanied minors and youth who end up as undocumented, which a large part of them do, unfortunately. So they look at that this group has a right to school by law, but in Swedish law that's been stated that undocumented migrants have a right to school, but their education still becomes the subject to a struggle between divergent discourses on children's human rights. So actors contesting restrictive interpretations of human rights, they draw on a discourse about students' everyday lives and feelings. So they kind of get into the nitty-gritty of how this right to education is negotiated locally in relation to a human rights discourse. In relation to integration, then you have a little bit more kind of a classical study by Selikasoy and Wadensjö. They study statistically labor market integration. And labor market integration is when you talk about integration policy in Sweden, that's what you basically talk about in policy. It's labor market integration. Integration is labor in the labor market, at least in the kind of mainstream policy understanding. So they study this aspect of integration by examining the labor market situation of the whole population of the refugee youth, as all the refugee youth who have applied for asylum in Sweden as unaccompanied minors between 2003 and 2012. So there is data like this in Sweden, and then they compare that to the rest of the population in the same age cohort of people born in Sweden or of any other background in Sweden. And one interesting finding they made is that youth who arrived on their own compared to those who arrived with their families, that those who arrive on their own, they are more likely to be employed and to earn more money than those who arrive with their families. So this group has, they're not just vulnerable; they're also very, they express a lot of agency and are able to build a life in Sweden as well, although they go through very harsh. In many ways, often very harsh trajectories before and during and after migrating to Sweden. In relation to health, one important study that also I wanted to highlight here is that the suicide rates among unaccompanied minors youth compared to Swedish-born young people in the same age was 50 young people per 100,000 among unaccompanied minors committed suicide, whereas among the rest of young people, that number was only 6. So 50 instead of 6 per 100,000. So there's a significant, almost 10 times as common among young unaccompanied youth to commit suicide compared to other groups. And this says something I think, very important about how the group has been treated in Sweden. Say, I mean, primarily the group that has been rejected asylum. That Sweden, you know, this outcome just tells you kind of a lot that you need to know about how harsh it can be to be in Sweden, to be rejected in the Swedish asylum system, and then what follows afterwards. And just a few more examples here. This one is a really important one by Liv Strietmo, who came in 2014, a dissertation, and where she does this analysis that I talked about before, about how unaccompanied minors are constructed and governed as a specific group in Sweden. She also compared it with Norway, where unaccompanied minors often, or were sometimes singled out as vulnerable children or child victims, but then concurrently also as possible strategic migrants and kind of as a threat. So they're both at risk of, because they are in vulnerable conditions, but they're also a risk to the whole society as vulnerable and risky subjects. So there's this, that's the understanding, so to say, that kind of comes through in policy around unaccompanied minors. So this poses, so for example, if adults, this idea of, or fear of that some of these minors are actually adults that fake and try to fake it as kids, as children, because their likelihood of getting asylum is much bigger than if you apply as an adult. So these kind of discussions and debates and discourses that grow out of those, out of this, was studied by Strietmo early on in this period that I'm studying. And then in relation to reception, this is another example of just a variety where they studied how local families who supported individual unaccompanied minors, how they experienced that, and how they this highlights how civil society has taken a large responsibility for this group, especially often many local families who've taken in someone to live in their homes. And last, I think this is a really, unfortunately it's in Sweden, but this anthology was really important, looking into the lack of rule of law after the 2015 changes in Swedish migration policy. And covers many different issues in different chapters about age assessments, local activism, legislative changes, legal guardians. I don't know, maybe Karin, if you were part of this, I can't remember now, but a lot of colleagues are part of this, are part of this collection. So what I want to ask to all this literature when I do this review is, you know, why is this research, why do we have so much research relatively in Sweden on this? What's the rationale they use? Was it only that there were so many? Is that enough? What does that reproduce different presuppositions? And will the interest then fade when the numbers go down in a few years in this group? Or so that's something I want to think about, and also like what methods are being used and to what extent and why. Who are included as research subjects and why? Can we learn anything about counting the total numbers of participants in different categories? And also, how are different actors' knowledge valued within this? Any trends or themes, for example, how professionals are valued and migrants themselves are valued in their narratives. I'll come back to this in a brief moment here. So some preliminary results that everyone is asking for more collaboration. This is the kind of solution that in relation to support structures, but there is also a lot of the publication highlight the complexities and dilemmas that are involved in this topic, and some also show how unaccompanied migrants do navigate these hostile policies and discourses, and want to contrast simplified understandings and prejudices about this group. So my plan is to discuss this and try to make like an overall discussion on what we can say about this whole research field. And as I showed you, there are many different and contrasting perspectives in this literature, and this rationale based on the numbers. And I'm thinking, so far, I think there's a few concepts also I'm trying to see what's missing so far. So the themes of demigrantization, that's a kind of a current trend in migration research to discuss, and also critical integration themes in relation to current debates on neocolonialism and integration that you kind of partly mentioned, Karin, as well, especially in relation to this famous article by Schinkel in Critical Migration or comparative migration, that's been getting a lot of interest. So that's something I'm thinking about maybe to highlight in the conclusion of my article, that this is missing from what I've seen so far. And one tension I just want to highlight is this great book, a great editorial collection that includes a lot of the key researchers in the field. But just to show you as a last point here before I finish is that, I know I'm past 30 minutes just now, but so it's called Unaccompanied Experiences and Professionals Experiences. The problem is that experiences, upplevelser and erfarenheter, they're two different words, but in English I can't find any other translation that they both turn into experiences. But what's interesting just with this title of this book, that there is this seemingly that more weight when it comes to professionals' experiences, erfarenhet, that relates more to kind of knowledge you've gained through experience, whereas upplevelse, which is what Unaccompanied are asked about, that relates more to what the feelings you've had or views you develop. So I see just in this title, and this might be a bit unfair, this critique, but there is a tendency here that I'm like kind of seeing if I can find in the rest of the data as well, that unaccompanied are treated a little bit more as kind of emotional beings and maybe not as rational, whereas the professionals have more kind of rational knowledge based on experience. So that's one thing I'm thinking about as a potential conclusion. But it's too early to say if it's just a case of this title of this book, or if this is a tendency in the research throughout. So can we say something we don't know by reviewing, just looking at each individual publication, and instead looking at it at the same time? Is there any new knowledge that can be found through that? And also, are there any reason for doing more research, or what kind of research would be still useful after conducting this review? That's also something I hope to find. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for being a little bit rushed, but happy to hear any comments or questions.